Welcome to the Early Childhood Voices Conference 2020. My name is Belinda Downey and my presentation today is Leadership within the Early Childhood Sector and Narratives of Hope. To begin with, I would like to make an acknowledgement and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country on which I'm standing, the Wiradjuri people. As this conference is about early childhood voices, I've asked my own children to assist me with the acknowledgement, and so I have recorded it.
I'd like to say thank you to the Wiradjuri people for letting us share your land.
We promise to look after it, all the people and animals too. Hello wind, hello sky,
Hello friends.
This presentation is based on the research that was undertaken as part of my PhD dissertation, The Cinderella Profession. Are invisible gender and cultural discourses that constitute the early childhood education and care sector influencing early childhood educators' constructions of their profession? Participants included 34 early childhood educators working across the top end of the Northern Territory in Australia. Yarning sessions were undertaken discussing the early childhood profession and the impact of government policy and policy reforms on their role. The methodological approach that was used was constructivist grounded theory, which utilised thematic analysis, and that was conducted on the transcripts. My aim when I began this study was to unpack how early childhood education sector was viewed or constructed by the educators who were working within the industry, and how did they see their role. This study was specifically focused on the top end of the Northern Territory in Australia, which is Darwin and its surrounding suburbs. My intention was that by collating a small group of educators' narratives, I would be able to get a better understanding of how educators view or understand their role and their profession. There were two main narratives that emerged from the educators when they were discussing their role. The first narrative was hopefulness, and the second narrative was struggling. Those who identified as having a hopeful narrative were those educators who constructed stories about their profession as a profession that had a hopeful future with diverse possibilities available to them. The educators who constructed their role with that of struggling had narratives that discussed issues with bureaucracy and bureaucratic requirements. These educators were struggling with their role in regards to management expectations and regulatory requirements, as well as time constraints and pressure they felt to complete or meet these expectations. Overarching these two narratives was the concept of finding balance. The educators' abilities to find balance in their work where they felt satisfied impacted on the level of satisfaction they felt within their role. In regards to leadership specifically, the educators who I identified as having narratives of hope were those that discussed feelings of being valued by their leader or team. Many stated this was due to the team's aligned philosophical and educational values. The educators discussed that this alignment of philosophy and the educational values was built on a willingness by the team to listen to each other and the children and families and find collective common grounds to differing situations. Conversely, those educators who discussed narratives of struggling within their roles indicated that they felt unvalued in their role by their management. These educators also discussed the value emphasis that they felt was being placed on the outcomes-based regulatory requirements, and this led to educators enacting resistance to management direction, which also had repercussions relating to communication breakdown. The definition of leadership is constructed socially and culturally and is underpinned by what society values. It is defined differently in different countries, industries, sectors, and organisations. Traditional understanding of leadership is that leadership is independent, authoritative, and competitive. Relationships are power-based and hierarchical in nature. This is problematic within the early childhood sector, as its main premise is one of caring, nurturing, education, and building and maintaining relationships, so essentially very different philosophical bases. The early childhood sector is also highly feminised, with 91.1% female workforce, and often their experience of leadership within the early childhood sector is not traditional. Leadership within the early childhood sector can be experienced as caring, relational, reflective, and collaborative, or distributed, so very different to the traditional style of leadership. There is also a differentiation made between a manager and a leader in this study in regards to leadership. Within this study, I have used the definition of a manager as one that is traditionally hierarchical within a hierarchical system that has authority structures. A leader does not necessarily hold a position of management, and whilst a leader's role can include those of a manager, a leader also offers inspiration, vision, and often their interactions affect their team's values and beliefs. One major differentiation between leadership and management I have utilised in this study is that leadership is imparted to the leader by those within the team. It is not just a position of management. Therefore, you can be a manager and not a leader but not a manager, or both a leader and a manager simultaneously. The leaders who are identified by the educators in this study as leaders utilised positivity in their approach. These leaders were intentional in their approach as a leader and became part of the narrative of hope that the educators discussed. These leaders displayed leadership that the participants inferred as courageous, ethical, and invoked activism, agency within their services and their community. Before I discuss the hopeful narratives that educators had, I would like to first discuss the struggles, as without an understanding of what the educators in this study struggled with, it's hard to understand where their hope builds from. Some of the participants within this study had experiences with people in legitimate authority positions, but they were not seen as leaders by the participants themselves. In an attempt to enact and ensure the integrity of education and care for the children, some of the participants began attempting small acts of resistance. I identified these small acts of resistance as part of the narrative of educators who were struggling with the management they were working with. One of the acts of resistance participants attempted was to hold those in authority as accountable. They did this with respectful questioning of practices and requests for these practices to be explained further. These questions and requests were often attempted on multiple occasions. This act of resistance for them was linked with advocacy for the children and integrity of the educational practices. The participants were questioning authorities because their practices were impacting the children. An example of this was participants questioning programming decisions or questioning the amount of paperwork that was being required. Another act of resistance was when participants continued to practice behaviour that they believed was important for the children's well-being, but which those in authority did not. An example of this was a participant picking up or soothing an upset child even after being told not to. Again, these acts of resistance for the participants was linked with child advocacy and educational integrity. Whilst the children benefited from these acts of resistance and were being advocated for by the educators, there was a negative flow-on effect for some participants, and they were met with horizontal violence. Horizontal violence is a psychological form of oppression. Psychological actions are used to reinforce compliance and conformity in certain ways of acting or thinking. Essentially, horizontal violence is enacted to discourage new ideas or discussions, and any individual who does not comply or conform risks marginalisation from the team. This type of environment where horizontal violence occurs does not encourage reward, caring, relational, reflective, or collaborative leaders. What eventually occurred was that educators were left with only two options: either accept and conform with what was being asked of them, or continue their small acts of resistance. Some of the participants in this study found a third option, which was to continue to resist, but to do so by moving on and finding another service where they felt their educational values were more philosophically aligned. Bureaucracy was another struggle that participants discussed in relation to leadership and management. As part of a government policy to improve quality of education and care within Australia, an assessment and ratings process, also known as the accreditation rating system, was implemented. In this process, services are assessed against a national quality standard by their individual state or territory regulatory authority. Authorised officers assess services against these standards to determine which quality category the service is awarded, working towards, meeting, or exceeding. Many participants discussed struggling with the management of their expectations of quality when compared against those of the regulatory requirements. Often their expectations were much higher. Educators also struggled with the outside structural pressures that dictated to them what quality care must look like. These educators could see the diverse and subjective nature that the term quality has, and this was part of the struggle for them. The Australian accreditation system attempts to fit the subjective concept of quality into a values-based measurable norm, and educators in this study struggled with this. They struggled due to the disconnect between what educational integrity looks like versus what can be accounted for or ticked off on a checklist, when quality is assessed against outcomes-based requirements such as paperwork. What makes this particular struggle so problematic is that quality is not a neutral, measurable norm. Therefore, authorised officers, leaders or managers, and educators can all interpret these measurable norms very differently, which some of the participants in this study struggled with. But the solution to these narratives of struggle, thankfully, can be found within the narratives of hope. So let's explore them now. The narratives within this study that I identified as hopeful were when educators discussed enjoyment of their profession and or their role. In regards to leadership specifically, hopefulness was identified when educators discussed feeling valued by their leader and or by their team. These participants also identified hope within leadership styles that were conceptually constructed with love and valuing as a foundation. Leadership styles such as a love-based leadership focus on the well-being of not only the leader, but the well-being of the people the leader is responsible for. This includes their employees, their co-workers, children and families. It is a leadership style that is based in exhibiting kindness, compassion and trust. Its main aim is to create an environment that is encouraging of learning and is developed from reflective practice. It is usually evident within a non-threatening environment that assists not only the children, but the educator team as well. This style of leadership was what many participants in the study identified as being important for them. That is, a leadership that is based on relationships, but that also creates a space for participants' roles to be developed holistically, which in turn benefits the children and the education team as a whole. Participants with narratives of hope discussed inspirational, interdependent leadership. This type of leadership set goals for individuals, but achieving these goals were also interdependent on the team and each other. Participants discussed leadership that role-modelled intentional, ethical and inclusive decision-making and actions. These types of leaders made the educators in this study feel valued and heard. However, what the participants felt was more important than this was that those leaders also valued the education and care of the children and families too. It was the leaders' valuing of the children and families that gave educators hope in their role and in their profession. That they were valued as educators was important, but that the children and families they cared for were valued by their leaders was more important to them. So how did these leaders do this? And what is the answer for those educators that have narratives of struggling? The main point that was raised again and again by the participants and by the research surrounding this topic was that hope for these educators stemmed from the critical conversations. Those conversations that developed relationships, but also built the integrity of the children's education. Essentially, it came down to communication. Hope stemmed from communication, but not just any communication. Communication that created critical reflection to necessitate improved understanding of practice. Research has identified that many leaders struggle with robust conversations. This key element is linked back to an image or identity of niceness. This identity was one that Ian Stonehouse discussed over 25 years ago, that early childhood educators are more than just nice. This identity of being nice holds a lot of power and impacts educators and managers' abilities or willingness to be proactive, to advocate, and to hold the difficult conversations. However, in order for this sector's educators to have hope, they need leaders that are willing to do this. Early childhood educators can be advocates, they can be activists, they can be proactive, they can be leaders, and they can do all of this with intention, inclusion, and integrity. Participants in this study have identified that they work with or are themselves these types of leaders. This sector as a whole, from the governing bodies and the policymakers, through to the educators, families, children, and the community, all come from different perspectives with different focuses, values, and beliefs. What we need is to come to a collective agreement on how we as a whole can conceptualise early childhood, but also the future of our early childhood sector, a future that takes into account the complex structures that currently shape it. This can only be achieved with deep, democratic and reflective conversation. Conversations where all points of view are valued and everybody is asked to contribute, even our youngest community members. These respectful but crucial conversations need to begin in our services with a ground-up approach. This is the only way a true understanding of our communities, our families, our children can be understood. Through a ground-up approach as a sector, we can advocate the value of the sector and the people within it. This is where the educators in this study found hope, in the valuing of their educators' contribution, in the valuing of their role, in the valuing of the children and the families that they work with, and in the valuing of their opinions and their beliefs. The leadership that the early childhood educators defined in this study as making an impact on them were the leaders who built relationships and were willing to listen, to help find solutions and actions. These leaders had open conversations that held multiple perspectives and points of view, perspectives of the children, perspectives of the family, and perspectives of the educators. This valuing of voices was where hope was found. From that hope can come great collaboration and change. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. And I feel like this picture is a really good example of how our voice can help change the world.